we will transition.
All right. So can everyone see my screen okay? All right.
Yes.
All right, perfect. Well, without further ado, I will, sorry about that, accidentally jumped to the ending there. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Davis, and today I will be reporting with you my findings from my research regarding the evolution of the other in Cold War cinema from the era of the 1950s through the 1980s. For the sake of my research, I believe it is important to establish how I will be defining the other for this topic at hand. And so for the purpose of what I'm doing here today, the other is I would define as a social construct or a person or a group of people that exist outside of another. And due to this innate separation and lack of understanding of what exactly the other is, they are often perceived as unknown and dangerous. They are an idea that reflects an us and them mentality, that with clearly drawn borders and lines. And although the concept of the other has existed since humans could distinguish themselves from one another, one of the earliest uses of the term in academic circles was by philosopher Edmund Husserl, who did this in attempting to explain the nature of the innate separation felt among different groups, whether it be due to culture, religion, ideology, or race. And as Riva Castoriano, professor of sociology, states, the other is the stranger who is beyond being far and near, an element whose membership within the group involves both being outside it and confronting it. Now, this topic in particular was interesting for me because I was fascinated by the idea of how of the borders and the groups of people that are created in this type of human circles and everything along those lines. And I was particularly interested in America's others throughout the years. And during this Cold War period in question, the United States had their own other in the form of the communist power that was on the rise in the time following World War II. And so my thesis and argument on the matter is that the other's depiction in cinema changed during this period from being a concept that was clearly defined as something black and white in its nature to one that was based more on the gray and ambiguous as the American public's perception regarding their own real-world other began to evolve and change. Beginning in the 1950s with the alien cinema period and continuing through the post-Vietnam films of the 1980s, the other became more humanized and grounded in reality. And for the purpose of my research, I analyzed Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956, Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove from 1964, and Oliver Stone's Platoon from 1986. In my paper, I also explored Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, but for the sake of this presentation, I will focus exclusively on cinema from the time. And before I continue any further, I would like to ask my audience to keep in mind while they're watching how exactly media has influenced your perception of other people and what exactly it has taught you regarding the concept of the other. So following the detonation of the atomic bombs and the end of World War II, there was a sense of immense uncertainty in the hearts and minds of the American people as the United States was growing used to its role as a global superpower. This time was defined by a desire to establish a strong national identity and sense of unity shared by a loyal following of the hegemony. However, during this period, the Soviet Union was on the rise as well, and with it, the rise of communism as its ideology. And due to its influence and this power dynamic being so similar to the United States, it became a sort of bizarro version of America. And in a sense, it kind of took the attention away from the Axis threat of World War II and moved it to the communist threat today with nuclear annihilation. It was viewed as something dangerous and threatening by the American people due to the American people's desire to solidify their own cultural identity during this time. And as a result, it became a kind of moral war for some Americans, which is a sentiment that is reflected in a quote from former US Congressman John Rankin, who once stated, "Communism is older than Christianity. It is the curse of the ages. It hounded and persecuted the Savior during his earthly ministry, inspired his crucifixion, and has spent more than 1900 years trying to destroy Christianity and everything based on Christian principles." So during this time, there was an understanding that Hollywood and the films it produced were the clearest route into the hearts and minds of the American people. And during this time, due to that influence, there was a fear that the communist powers had already infiltrated Hollywood and were producing films trying to spread communist ideals. And this led to the Hollywood Red Scare, in which many actors and directors were investigated and blacklisted for being for supposedly being members of the Communist Party. And due to this understanding of the power of cinema at the time of this period, there was a belief that films produced during this period needed to display the positive values of American ideals while also at the same time combating communism and its influence. And as Jay Haberman proposes in his book, An Army of Phantoms, in American Movies and the Making of the Cold War, the movie industry's true mission was to produce good pictures of American life and show an unhappy world how democracy works. Among the films produced during this time to reflect this anxiety regarding the communist infiltration and subversion, Don Siegel's Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 stands out as a shining example of this alien cinema that was popular during this time. The film tells the story of a small American town being threatened by an unidentifiable terror from another world that is seeking to infiltrate and assimilate its population. The film's depiction of the aliens as a force of chaos with an unclear shape and appearance to it reflected the American perception of communism at the time as a force that was out there, but still very unknown to the average person in its appearance. This fear of the communist threat in the film was specifically reflected in the way it addressed concerns of losing one's identity and humanity through assimilation by a faceless enemy that appears normal enough on the surface and also played on fears of brainwashing at the time. And when Dr. Miles Bennell, the main character of the film, pleads in the film, "Look, you fools, you're in danger. Can't you see? They're after you. They're after all of us. Our wives, our children, everyone. They're here already. You're next." This plea could also be seen as a kind of warning to the American people of the foreign threat that has infiltrated the country. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove from 1964 represented a time in the filmmaking world when the fear and reverence regarding the communist threat was on a decline. The film tells the story of both the United States and Russia seeking to stop a nuclear war from starting between the nations after US General Jack D. Ripper goes rogue and seeks to stage a preemptive strike against the Russians. In being a satire of traditional Cold War thrillers of the time, the film asks its audience to make light of the end of the world in a way through its depiction of the two sides as comedically inept in dealing with the crisis, as well as humor on the matter of the arms gap, which was a big fear at the time and is a central part of the story as a whole. The film also offered an important factor in the depiction of the other going forward, in the sense that it showed the United States being the instigator of the crisis through the character of General Ripper, who links his erectile dysfunction to a communist conspiracy to destroy America. He elaborates on these thoughts when he states, "I can no longer sit back and allow communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids. Sorry about that. The fact that World War III is about to occur because General Ripper is insecure about his inability to please a woman sexually helps in driving home this point that America does not stand on any particular higher moral ground compared to the Russians, who are portrayed as equally bumbling and inept. And this film suggests that the other does not always come from outside of a group's borders, but it can also come from within. The 60s continued on. Many Americans have begun to feel the fatigue of the fight against communism and the amount of resources and manpower that had been spent in conflicts such as the ones in North Korea and Vietnam. This period also reflected a rise in the counterculture movements of the time, which were working against the notion of hegemony established in the previous decades. These movements included civil rights, campaigns for disenfranchised people, as well as protests against the war in Vietnam specifically. This time reflected a period when the other was being fought for on a national stage, and many were wondering what business the nation had in dealing with the foreign affairs in the name of a moral crusade. Of the films produced during the post-Vietnam era, Oliver Stone's Platoon from 1986 was a prime example of the attitude many Americans had regarding the conflict in Vietnam. The film tells the story of Chris Taylor and the platoon he is a part of while stationed in Vietnam. And inspired by Stone's own service in the region during the war, the film explores the brutality both sides inflicted on each other during this conflict. Platoon reflects the sense of moral ambiguity surrounding the whole conflict in the way in which it questioned both America's role and presence in Vietnam, as well as the vision of the enemy and what exactly America's national mythology had done to the average American soldier's perception of what they were fighting for. The film shows that the United States to have become the other in a sense, particularly through the character of Sergeant Barnes, a violent and cold-blooded killer who does not see the Viet Cong as anything more than a threat that needs to be put down. The brutality of his actions reflects the sentiment that the United States had become the dangerous invading other in their attempt to defeat the communist threat they believed to be seeking to infiltrate them. This idea that anyone can be the other is reflected in one of Chris Taylor's final lines of the film when he says, "I think now, looking back, we did not fight the enemy. We fought ourselves. The enemy was in us." And I believe that gets to my main points of this whole discussion. Although it began during the alien cinema era of the 1950s as a reflection of the national fear of the unknown and foreign powers of the communist, the other has evolved over the years into a concept with many different faces and places where it can originate from, until there came to be an understanding that the other can be anyone. It all just depends on a matter of perspective. I believe this discussion regarding the other is important to have in all intellectual circles, whether it be academic or non-formal, due to its relevance even today. As long as there are people out there who are different from one another, the other will always exist as a construct because there will always naturally be some kind of disconnect between different groups. However, an acknowledgement of the other's deeper and fundamental qualities will help in shaping the discourse between these differing entities, because there will be an understanding that the other is a matter of perspective and the other can be anyone and come from anywhere. And no one stands on any particular higher moral ground in the conflict. Thank you for attending my presentation today, and I would like to take this time to thank Dr. Brent as well as the other English faculty who have helped me get to this point. I really appreciate your attention, and I will now open the floor to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. It looks like we already have some questions out there, so I'm going to shut up and let you speak as soon as you stop presenting. There you go, Matt.
All right, let me take a look at that. it is very likely that something like that quote from Congressman Rankin almost gave a certain I don't know exactly how to describe it, but a kind of political platform or a sense of political rightness on the part of anybody who was seeking to persecute other minorities in the name of protecting certain sense of unity and everything along those lines. And I believe that this time in Hollywood, this conflict in Hollywood during the time just reflected, I guess, an overall sense of trying to maintain a cultural identity and strong sense of the mythology. And I imagine that it was just playing on a concept of persecution and prejudice that exists no matter in what group you go. What form of the other do you believe is the most influential other? I'm not really sure how to describe what would be the most influential other, but I guess I could also answer my I can answer Melinda's question in this one with Julia here. I think that the concept of the other is almost more influential depending on which side, like which era you come from. A lot of people who are more my age probably know the other as more of like fear of Middle Eastern influence, such as, you know, Islamic, or fear of being attacked again from after 9/11. Whereas the communist threat is something that I believe is more influential for people who grew up during the Cold War era. And I believe that the other has remained and survived throughout the years as a concept because, as I has talked about with the Axis threat and shifting to the communist threat, people have a tendency to try and evolve their enemies in some capacity when they realize they can't and like delve into the mystery of their previous enemy. They can now put it to something else. So this time of when we had the communist threat, the Cold War ended, and during this time also we had the rise of the stuff in the Middle East, and it almost seems like there's always this innate fear of something that we don't completely understand. I believe that's how it has remained. I believe that having an okay, do you think it is important to possible that we need to perceive the other in order to know who we are? I believe it's very true, actually. It's actually on a very psychological level, if you know anything about sort of like Jungian psychology, kind of that sense of the other is like a darker side of ourselves or like another half of our own personality. And there's this concept that which we don't understand because it might also reflect something within ourselves that we would like to ignore, which I believe a lot of people's perceptions regarding the Vietnam conflict explores in an immense way, because now we become, depending on how you look at it, the invader in a sense. I agree. I'd love to write a paper. If I was able to kind of have complete control over the direction that this would have been, I would have just done an entire project on John Carpenter.
Well, I would love for this to become a larger discussion, but in the interest of time, I'm going to ask us to press on. Thank you very much, Matt, for
thank you very much for your time.
Presentation. Why don't you go ahead and mute your mic? And I'm going to turn it now to Sarah Marshall, and Sarah is